Since we've finished up talking about rangeland animals, their digestive systems, and how that shapes their diet selection, we're now going to dive into the range plants and more specifically the forage value associated with range plants. We're going to look specifically at the three major categories of plant types that we find on rangeland: grasses, shrubs, and forbs. So as you guys probably know, especially if you've taken Dr. Phillips' nutrition class or feeds and feeding, there are 6 major nutrients that are required by animal organisms: carbohydrates, fats, proteins, minerals, vitamins, and the one that everybody forgets about, water. When we look at energy requirements of individual animals, those animals are going to need energy requirements to do basic functions, and the degree or the amount of energy needed by an individual animal is going to depend on what production stage they are in. So we're going to start with energy because it's going to be the most limiting nutrient in the western part of the U.S. So keep in mind we're going to also talk quite a bit about protein as well, because we tend to think in terms of protein and how much protein a plant or a pasture will actually support, because we're usually concerned as ranchers with growing animals, and growing animals need high concentrations of protein. All right, so energy is going to come in 2 major forms: structural and non-structural carbohydrates. And the structural carbohydrates are going to be the cellulose cells. So those are going to be associated with the structure part of the plant. And so energy can be broken down into sugars and starches, and to a limited degree fats. And energy that is going to be obtained from fats is going to be very important for birds and for rodents, because they are going to need to take in a higher concentration of energy per bite compared to our grazing animals. Protein is also a really limiting limiting nutrient on rangeland, and protein is going to be made up from compounds that have lots of nitrogen associated with it. So one of the nutrient analysis that we do in the lab on a regular basis is actually testing a feedstuff for how much nitrogen it has, because nitrogen is going to be dictating protein. Other nutrients that tend to be limiting on rangeland are phosphorus, and phosphorus isn't one of those micro minerals that we supplement for on a regular basis, so it will actually go into kind of like a mineral pack in pretty small concentrations. So just realize that phosphorus is pretty limiting as far as minerals on rangeland as well. And then vitamins too. So we're going to see quite a bit of supplementation of vitamin A or carotene. So the 3 major factors that determine how much nutritive value a plant has are its cellular structure, so more specifically the ratio of the cell wall components to the rest of the plant components, so structural versus non-structural carbohydrates. The second major limiting factor, or major factor determining the nutrient value of a plant, is going to be the degree to which lignification actually occurs. And we'll talk about what lignin is in just a second. And then finally, the secondary compounds or the anti-quality factors that are associated with the plant can either increase or decrease a plant's palatability and nutritive value. So as we start to look at these different contributions to plant nutritive value, we need to remember our basic biology. So what we've got here is a cell, and more specifically a plant cell. So you can see that in our cell wall portion over here, our cell wall is going to contain things like cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, and then to a lesser extent, pectin, cutin, and silica. So the compounds that we're going to talk mostly about are cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. And then inside the cell are our solubles. So these are going to be not only the organelles like the Golgi apparatus, the mitochondria, the nucleus that contains the DNA, but also there's going to be carbohydrates and sugars or starches, as well as protein associated with the center portion of the cell structure. So when we're talking about cell wall versus cell solubles, this is the ratio that we're talking about. So the more cellular wall content and more intercellular content that we have, the more nutrient value a plant is going to have. So keep in mind, though, that in our annual grasslands, when the plant dies, this intercellular mass is going to move or translate out of the cell. And so those are our non-structural carbohydrates that are going to be moving. And so all of this living material inside the cell is going to be gone when the plant dies. But the energy in the hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin that's associated with the cell wall is still going to be there. So this is what enables a plant, even though it's dead, to still have some energy contribution. Lignification or lignin is a chemical compound that's very complex. You can see that from this figure down here. So this is the whole lignin structure. And it is really the indigestible portion of a cell wall. And this is going to bind together with other lignin molecules and is going to what we call impregnate cellulose. And this is going to form like wood structures. So if we think of wood associated with a tree, it's really hard to break down. It takes a long time to break down. That's because there's a lot of lignin associated with it. So the more lignification that actually occurs in a plant, the less palatable it's going to be because it can't be broken down very readily. Our third major component that can dictate how nutritive a plant is secondary compounds. And these anti-quality factors are going to occur in plants in the form of toxins or other compounds, and they're going to reduce the forage quality of that plant or have some sort of adverse effect on the animal. So for example, if an animal eats a toxic plant, then what ends up happening is it can actually upset the rumen microbes so that they don't digest the feed. The animal goes off feed and they have a negative experience associated with that plant. So for example, this picture here, this is lupin, and when ingested in high enough quantities, lupin can actually be very toxic to the animal and can result in death. But it also has major implications for reproduction because if it is consumed within about a 20-day period from day 35 to 55 of gestation, the calf can actually be severely deformed. All right, so as we're starting to look at different parts of a plant, there's the different structures that a plant has is going to have different nutritive values. So when we think about a plant in general, that plant is going to produce or is going to contain stems, leaves, roots, sometimes seeds and roots or seeds and berries as well. So the seeds, fruits, and then root crowns as well as flowers in general have higher levels of cell content or cell solubles. So they tend to be higher in protein and higher in energy. Okay, so just keep in mind that seeds can also contain high levels of fats, which become important for our rodent and bird species, as well as the omnivores that are trying to pack on pounds and body condition to get through the winter. All right, so when we think about plant parts, leaves, especially in shrubs, tend to be more nutritious than the stems. And this is because leaves actually have a lesser degree of lignin associated with them than the stem does. And so they have a high amount of cell solubles. So because their job is photosynthetic activity, so you can't have a lot of lignin cells associated with that material because lignin cells can't carry out photosynthesis, but the chloroplast cells can, and those are the ones that we find in the leaf matter. In addition, in shrubs that don't shed past year's growth, that past year's growth is less palatable and less nutritious than the new growth that's going to be associated with the shrub. And this all has to do with the degree of lignification that plant has. So the older the plant material associated with a shrub, the more lignin it's going to have. So if we think about this in terms of sagebrush, as sagebrush gets more mature year after year, every year it's adding a degree of lignification to its stem and its branch structures. So those branch structures tend to get thicker and more coarse, therefore they're going to be less palatable. All right, so we're going to stop there for this comparative nutrition portion, and we'll pick up part B in the next lecture.